We're a little past that. If we want to keep going with this conversation, we can do so after. All right. Week 6, which relates to some of what we were talking about anyway, so some of it may come up again, but council, saints icon. So I want to talk today about some of the more core elements of what we believe and where they come from. I think it's important to go through these councils because they show us who we are. It's important to understand, and the language I use will reflect this, that nothing new was done with any of these councils. They didn't come together and say, actually, we've all decided we're going to do a new thing now, right? All of these councils were affirming something that had been done and/or mostly rejecting something that was being brought up as a new thing. But we don't see in any of these a radical change in the direction the church is going. Anyone coming from a background where, Constantine dramatically changed the church or something like that, just doesn't really understand what happened at that first council, right? They weren't deciding to do new things, right? Nothing that came out of that was different from what had done before, or else we would see various areas in the church saying, hey, what? You're telling us to do what? That's not what we've done. And there would be a wild reconciliation where people trying to figure out how to do the old and the new and whatever. And that doesn't happen, right? All of these are simply clarifying language around what the church had already been teaching in one form or another, and rejecting the things that were new, that were not in continuity with the faith that had been practiced from the beginning. So, all right. I will also want to say very briefly before I get into these, I have given you here bolded the name of each council as you will often find it in other places. I think it is silly to use them, and much clearer and simpler to just say the first and second and third and fourth ecumenical council. It's a lot better than trying to remember which of the councils of Nicaea or Constantinople said which thing. You remember the first one said this and the second one said that. So after we go through this list here, I will simply refer to them as the first or the second or the third. But you've got that sort of thing, a list of them here. And like I said, you will absolutely run into these names in other locations and whatnot. So just so you're aware. All right, First Council of Nicaea. So obviously this is very early in the church, 325. This was mainly about Arianism. I'll do a lot of this today. What was Arianism?
It's, that Christ was a created being.
Yeah. So, sort of contrary to a lot of the problems that most people have with Christianity today, was to say that Jesus was a really, really good dude, but still just a really good, yes, the opposite of what I said. Very similar to what a lot of people believe today, right? He was a very good dude. He was maybe the best of the dudes, but still just a dude. And I want to make it clear, if any of you are at all familiar with church history, there are a number of things that branch off of Arianism that have various forms of, well, Jesus was a man and then an angel called Christ descended on him and took control of his body. And, there's all sorts of other things down the line that sort of branched off of Arianism in one form or another. Maybe not directly, not like a teacher or a student of Arius or whatever did this, but things that we can look back on and say, well, they're kind of grouped together as forms of Arianism that were kind of common around a few of these earlier councils. So you may run into some other interesting things. The one that I just said about the angel, that's real and wild to me because it's just a complete misunderstanding of what the word Christ means, which is what? What does it mean?
Anointed one.
Anointed one,
Messiah.
right? So very weird to say that actually that's just the name of an angel.
That still exists today. Jehovah's Witnesses.
Is that what they're teaching?
They believe Jesus was St. Michael the Archangel.
Well, maybe that is the same thing. I don't know.
Well, it's
Long
not
for us to
exactly,
not know.
but it's very Arian.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
very-
yeah.
Yeah, and then a lot, I don't know if this is the Jehovah's Witness thing, but that particular group I'm thinking of, a historical group anyway, said that at the Eli Eli lama sabachthani, my God, why are you forsaking me? That's when the angel leaves him. And so then the man dies on the cross.
Because I know that the Yazidi Christians believe that, basically.
Yeah, maybe that's-
in Iraq, yeah, that's
Yeah.
one of the things the Yazidis believe.
And there were, like I said, that's one example. There were others as well that had different kind of odd forms of similar things. But Arianism was definitely the most common and the one the church fought hardest against for the longest time. Is there a question there?
Yeah, so how long so obviously Arianism still exists today, but like the Arian church, let's say there was like a core group that was
Yeah.
around, like how long was that around for?
I'm quite positive that in small pockets in mountain villages or something, it probably persisted for a very long time.
Yeah.
In terms of any real force to be reckoned with, I think by the time we get to 5th or 6th-ish council, 500, 600, 700 or so,
Wow.
I think it had mostly died down, at least as I recall. But there were, so like the Goths were originally catechized and brought into the church by Arian clergy. So that was what they first were introduced with
Right.
to the Christian faith, was Arians.
Right.
So I'm positive that there were little pockets that lasted for far after that, but yeah, and just to be very clear, in case, I don't know, maybe this doesn't need to be said, but I don't believe there is any group today that, though Arian, has any actual connection to the original Arianism. I think it was one of those things where they just came up with it again themselves.
And how long did the first council last? Because I know it was long, like these went for many months, right?
The first council might have even been like a year or two.
Yeah.
Yeah, remember these were, I've talked about this in some of my own, but maybe I don't remember if anybody were here for that, but you have to remember that people didn't just hop on a plane. So when you're getting people together from all over the world, it takes a long time. And you're not just gonna have a little weekend get together, decide some stuff, and then go home, right? I mean, people are traveling for months to get here from the farthest reaches of the empire and whatever. So yeah, it was a long time. Lots of discussion, lots of group. I mean, even some of these, in the later ones, will even run into issues where the council starts and then a major delegation comes a month later. And then they have to try and recap and make sure they're still all on the same page and it doesn't go well. So much slower than these types of things happen today, where we do the All-American Council and it takes 4 days. We just all fly out to here, gentlemen, and be back for 3 days and then leave. But very much not like that.
That's,
All right, just real quick, this was the first time the church had run into such a systematic approach to theology, though heretical. And so the creed was written or composed, not quite the form that we use today, although very close. And it was in direct response to Arius having a creed. And so feeling the need to say, yeah, well, what do we actually all believe? There you go, the main creed. Again, just to reiterate, this was not a new thing. This was a summary of what they had always all believed, except Arius and his people. But yeah. All right. Questions on that one?
That was mainly just that one thing for the first one.
Mainly just Arianism. Yeah.
how long was Arianism around before that council started?
That's also a good question. A little while.
Was Arius present at the first council?
Yeah.
Okay, because he was defending his position.
He was a priest.
Yeah.
He had gotten several bishops on his side, but he was very clearly the source of it. Actually, by this point in time, he'd gotten quite a few people on his side, as we will see as it continues to become a problem with the subsequent councils, that it very nearly takes over the entire church before it's eventually fought back. Despite having already had a council where they theoretically all agree that this is not the thing we're going to do, it continues to be a big issue for a while. We call Arius sometimes the arch heretic, and Arianism the arch heresy. Which, in light of what we were saying just a minute ago about how it has come back again today, maybe isn't apt name for the heresy at least. All right, second council, the first council of Constantinople, 381. Not that long after the first, you may note, and they realized that it didn't, the creed as it was originally composed didn't do a good enough job of clearly making the three parts of the Trinity very equal. And so they added some additional language into the form that we use today. So every liturgy you go to, we sing the creed. That's what that is. It's been done pretty much continuously since about 381. I'm sure it took some time to be fully integrated in, again, more or less defined regions, but more or less from around that time, it's been pretty consistent in our services to creed. And it's, because it's a very foundational part of what we all believe, it's done in the second half of the service as we're preparing for communion, after the time when those that were not in the church yet would have been removed, so that any of the illegal pieces are only said in private. Again, Arianism had certainly not gone away at this point in time. That was not that long after the first one, so it was still a big issue and continued to become a bigger issue. And then we get the Council of Ephesus. So for the third ecumenical council, for 31, we run into Nestorianism for the first time, which is kind of an odd one, as much as these are all a little odd in their own way. So just real quick, if you look on the back of the definitions, I did give you at least a very, very brief summary of what the major heresies from the council are. So if you're curious or can't remember later which one Nestorianism was, there on the back. But so the basic tenet was Nestorianism really struggled with Jesus being God and man. You really couldn't come to terms with the idea of God being born as a baby and doing baby things. He just couldn't accept that. And so he did not want to call the Virgin Mary Theotokos, God bearer, but he wanted to call her Christotokos, Christ bearer. And he felt that that was a very important distinction because obviously she didn't carry God. God can't be a baby. God can't have been doing baby things and spitting up and kicking and learning to walk and all the things that babies do. He just really, really struggled with that idea. Of course, the response to Nestorianism that we see in monophysitism and monothelitism is an understanding that God has to have undergone that in order to be fully human. In order to be fully man, he must have done all the things man does, right? You can't just skip the unpleasant parts. It's not just the best hits of man, right? He has to do all of the things in order to be fully man. So this is kind of the foundation of some of those other responses later, yeah.
Yeah, so in a lot of, so this is more of a clarifying question around Nestorius and what he sort of advocated for, because I think there's I have heard an oversimplification of like, oh, it was just like a terminology issue, and but it sounds like there's like much more.
Nestorianism?
Yeah, like like he was saying Christotokos, and that's technically true, but also Theotokos, and so it's more of an emphasis on one aspect of Christ or something like that. It's like he kind of an oversimplification of Nestorianism, the issue of Nestorianism down to maybe like just a perspective on God, right?
That's interesting. I haven't heard that. You do hear that about monophysitism and monothelitism.
Yeah.
So that's just a semantic.
But Nestorius actually really seemed to teach like a very different view of who God was.
Yeah, if you read some of his writings, which I don't necessarily recommend, but if you do for one reason or another, he's pretty clear. He doesn't really hold bunches about what he.
Yeah.
I mean, he's pretty clear about his not believing that Christ was a baby, that God was a baby, that God was learning to do all the things that little babies learn to do. He's pretty straightforward about that.
Where would he say then Christ, like, gains the presence of God or the Spirit of God? Like, how does he reconcile that idea?
So in the Gospels, right, it talks about we have his birth, and then it says that he grew in wisdom and understanding, and then we kind of jump ahead. So that's the part that people in stories point to as, oh, well, he grew in wisdom and understanding, meaning that's when he either became aware of his divinity, or his divinity activated, or came upon him, if you're going to go down the route of some of the other weird ones we talked about earlier. But it's that phrase that they kind of hinge it on.
And who's the church that venerates Nestorius?
The Nestorian Church of the East.
Okay, and they're still around?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there might be others, but, yeah, the Church of the East is the main one as far as I'm aware.
Didn't the Catholic Church and the Church of the East sign an agreement like back then that like they believe like the same thing about like Mary and Jesus, and that apparently they're not like historian anymore?
It is my understanding that there is a group of the Nestorians that have come into communion with the Catholic Church. I don't know exactly how or what that meant, but that's part of my discussion before about the internal inconsistencies. So maybe they tried to say something about it just being a semantic issue, but if you look at what was said by Nestorius himself, it's pretty clear what he means. It's definitely not a semantic issue for him. It is definitely that he just cannot come to terms with God being a baby.
Okay, that's the better word to use, would be semantics. I think I haven't read a book actually, it's like a very popular book that sort of portrayed the Nestorian Church as like, oh, it's a semantics issue, I didn't quite understand it. Yeah.
Again, I would be really hesitant about that kind of thing, because remember, we're talking about hundreds of very well-educated people. At this point in time, a lot of the people that were speaking and defending the church, they weren't just little country backwater bumpkins that just fell into their positions. These were very well-educated people that took all forms of philosophy and religion, right? I mean, they didn't necessarily just come from a Christian background. It was very common at the time. In fact, really considered necessary in order to be able to respond to people, to have formal education in what they believe so that you can accurately respond to them. So, of course, with someone like Nestorianism, I don't think he necessarily had a school that people were going to in order to respond to him directly at the time, but definitely the things that he's pulling from are not foreign at the time. It is very normal for these people to be well educated. So, anytime one person thinks that they're somehow smarter than a council, I really got to chuckle a little bit, because not to say that we haven't also grown in wisdom and understanding, since these are not stupid people. Right. They knew the faith, they knew what they were dealing with. As we talked about, they were there for a good while discussing this and hashing out with Nestorius himself. So,
and he pretty much refused to sort of recant his views.
Yeah, Arius both.
Yeah. Interesting.
All right. Anything else on that one? It's good. This is the two big ones. So, talk about them. All right. So Chalcedon. This is not technically the first split like we talked about before with the Nestorian Church split previously, but this was the first major split in the church. So Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, repudiated a new thing called monophysitism, which if we look on the back, monophysitism said that Jesus had one in nature, human and divine. So this was an understanding that that Jesus was fully God and fully man, but that he had one nature, it says here, combined, composite nature. Now, our response to this is to say that, yes, of course, he's fully God and fully man, but you can't be fully God and fully man unless he has both a full nature that is divine and a full and complete nature that is human. And that is why he is important, is because he is both God and man in full, two separate, unmingled natures.
Would that if I'm understanding this correctly, would that essentially say that Christ's or Jesus' nature is some kind of third nature?
That is exactly our response. Yep.
Wow,
To
okay.
say
I
that
never understood it that way until now.
If his nature is a composite nature, we don't have that nature, therefore his saving work doesn't affect us. We have no life in him. His death and resurrection are meaningless for us in ascension, because he didn't do that with our nature. He did it with a new, unique, composite nature of God and man.
And this would be why, especially the Immaculate Conception, is something the Orthodox would reject, right?
Yep.
Because that becomes a third nature.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah.
same foundation for the Immaculate Conception. So if either of you are not familiar with this, it's the understanding that Mary was conceived in a way separate from the rest of humanity and therefore was free of the original sin, meaning she had a nature that was different than the rest of us. Jesus took his nature from her, which means he would have taken that new, unique, without original sin nature that we don't have, died, resurrected, ascended with that nature, and again, just like here, now we have no part in that. Right? Because again, for us, his saving work is saving because he did it as one of us. He did it with exactly what we are. And because he did it with exactly what we are, then we can follow him, and we have life in him. But if he was not exactly what we are, we don't have any life in him.
Isn't that like pretty clear too? Like in the scripture, you see Jesus. He clearly gets tired. Like
Yeah.
when we comes like he said, he fell asleep because he was walking all day.
Yeah.
He was thirsty. So
Yeah,
Like,
I really
there's
don't
two-
like the show The Chosen,
yeah,
but it does do a good job of highlighting his humanity, I would argue, at the
Yeah.
expense of his divinity.
yeah, too much.
But it does highlight his humanity, and
Yeah.
that's very true. Yes.
So then the Orthodox position is sort of like what you said, the biblical perspective of like them having both natures, that I guess in that sense it becomes a mystery in the right sense, that it's like, yeah, they existed together
Yes.
in a way that, can't be maybe quantified in a scholastic, consubstantial. Okay, yes, this is, wow, this is all making sense after 38 years. Now I'm finally understanding these terms.
Isn't it also like what you were saying too earlier about he? Does it say that one that has like quote like he like whatever he assumes he feels, and that's exactly
Yes.
what you're saying. Like there's this combined nature, then that can't go on because this whole other thing. But since he experienced humanity in its fullness, and humanity is completely redeemed.
Yes. I also want to pause really quick, so you're all correct, I'm glad this is clear. I really quick want to pause. You will see the technical Greek terms thrown around a lot, theses and other words. I'm intentionally not using them because we speak English here, and English is what we understand and can clearly speak about. So it is much easier to say nature. I think we all understand what that is than to try and switch into a Greek word. And that is generally how I will approach these classes. Unless I really need to fall back on a Greek word or something, I will try to avoid that because it's just needlessly complicated. And I'm trying to remember, wait, was species the one that means this thing or that thing? Right? And I could have just said nature. So, all right. Okay. Makes sense? Good. All right. The fifth. Sorry. Yes, sorry. Oh, so really quick about the Council Chalcedon. So one of the big problems with this one, as I recall, was that this was the one where a delegation, I think from Alexandria, came late. They got delayed, and they started without them, and they got really angry about that, and it was a whole big thing. And one of the things that they were very upset about was the fact that they didn't feel like some of the decisions that had been made and some of the statements that were being accepted were doing enough to combat Nestorianism. Because just like Arianism, it didn't just die out. I mean, this next one is literally 20 years after the first. So Nestorianism was still very much a problem. And they really felt strongly that it wasn't doing enough to be not Nestorian. So actually, interestingly, the non-Chalcedonian churches today, they argue that we are crypto-Nestorian, that our approach is too much like Nestorius.
Wow.
So, just connect some dots there, maybe. All right. Second council, or the fifth ecumenical council. So this one didn't do a whole lot on its own. Most of what this did was kind of pull everything together and reaffirm what had been said before. A lot of these issues were still around from the previous councils and hadn't really been fully dealt with. So this was an opportunity to say, no, really, we mean it. This is not okay. It clarified some things from the previous councils, and it also put out, put out some canon stuff on its own. But again, this one was not a direct response to a new thing as much as it was responding to the continuing problems of the previous councils that had not been fully resolved. All right, sixth ecumenical council or third council Constantinople. So this is the first one, or the next one where we get a new thing on Catholicism. Again, if you look back, one combined will, divine, and human. And our general response to that was the same thing as the previous response to monophysitism. If he has a full human nature and a full divine nature, then he has the wills of both of those. Which is why we see in our explanation for some of John's rather long statements that Jesus makes in the garden, right, where he has this concern for what's going to happen. He has a human response to knowing that he's going to go to a very painful death, and also being divine and knowing exactly how painful it's going to be, right? We're seeing those two wills exist inside of him, but also seeing the perfect human nature, which is not just doing what's good for itself, but what is good and needful and according to God's will for all things. So that's what that is. And again, it really isn't, from our perspective, that different from monophysitism. If you're going to try and say that something about him is combined, then we're saying that it is not fully the two. It's its own new thing. And though you can try and say it is full and complete, but also combined, we just find that hard to believe. Now, you've made a new third thing, and that is a different thing. So, all right. It's not generally considered its own council, so the Aquinas text, or there's another word, hand-peaked council, or Council of Trullo, is not generally considered to be its own council because it really actually did not do anything at all, and mostly raised some local canons and did some clerical discipline things, and again, mostly just sort of took canons from the Sixth Council and published them. Because the Sixth Council didn't actually publish anything. In the previous ones, they kind of all come together in these encyclicals and lists of canons of the ways that we do things and don't do things. The Sixth didn't really do that very much, but the Council of Trullo or the Sixth Council did, sort of on behalf of that council. You can see it was really not that long after the first one. So, it's often considered to basically just be a continuation of the Sixth Council. All right. And then the Seventh Ecumenical Council, or the Second Council of Nicaea. So by this point in time, the Muslim world had started becoming a thing and had separated the non-Chalcedonian and Chalcedonian churches. And so there's not a lot of, whereas previously we see these attempts to kind of come back together and hash things out again, even though there was continuing to be disagreement, but trying to have discussions and come to some unifying understanding that we could all get behind. That kind of stops at this point in time because we just didn't have good ways to communicate across that barrier. And so we just kind of stopped. But we have a new problem that sort of comes out of that as well, which is iconoclasm. So there's some debate about where iconoclasm comes from, but one of the popular theories, and one that I personally think makes a lot of sense, is that in the face of the rising threat of Islam, there was attempts, especially as we start seeing some lands get taken over, to try and make yourself less of a target. And Islam is very opposed to images, which is why Hagia Sophia is resurfaced with just designs and patterns. If you've ever seen inside of it as a mosque, it doesn't have the icons anymore, the overall thing, except in a few places where they specifically uncovered them to show the history. But largely speaking, they don't do that. And so there's some thought that maybe some of this was driven by a feeling that, well, if we can sort of get rid of the controversial parts, maybe they won't treat us as harshly. Of course, I don't think it's fair to say that's the only reason. I'm sure there were other reasons as well. But it became a pretty big deal. If you go to some churches to this day in Greece, you can see the marks on the wall where they chiseled the icons because the mosaic, or not the mosaic, the way we usually make icons is actually directly into the wall. So you can't just take them off like you can these. This is the kind of thing we do in a space that isn't permanent, but usually they are put into the plaster of the wall as it dries. It makes them a lot more durable, they last a lot longer time. But it also means when you're trying to take them down, really your only option is to chip into them to make little marks and then plaster over the top. So you can still see churches where they had done that and then eventually came back and removed that plaster, but you still have all these chip marks that are all the icons. Of course, if you're familiar with our modern practice of remembering this council, this is when we do the big procession of all the icons around the church, remembering the restoration. There was a lot of back and forth around this time. There were certain groups that felt strongly that icons were important, but we just shouldn't venerate them. And so there were proponents of not having any icons down below, but having them up high, sort of like just having the ones around our church that show the stories of the New Testament, and as you'll sometimes see in the Old Testament and the Narthex, just to be sort of like teaching instruments, but not to have the ones down below that you can venerate. This is also where we get a distinction between worship and veneration, which in English, I know those words don't really feel that different outside of the Orthodox world, but we do make a clear distinction within the Orthodox world, that worship is only for God. We don't worship the icons, we don't worship each other, we don't worship anything except God. If you're a stockholder, falling down in worship, that is for God. But we show veneration for all sorts of things, for each other, for icons, for relics. And so we go up and we kiss them. We show this veneration, this love for them. And there's a sort of iconic phrase that was coined at the time, goes along the lines of the veneration of an icon passes on to the prototype, meaning that we're not kissing the wood and the paint because of the wood and the paint, but because of the person depicted there. And by venerating, now we're not venerating the wood and the paint, but we're venerating the person. It passes on to the prototype, to the person that's being depicted in the image. Again, making that distinction that it's not an idol that we're worshiping for the sake of the idol, but venerating the person. And in doing so, we are showing honor to God because all of these people, the saints are the people that followed God's will, right? That did so perfectly enough, at least, that we remember them and set them apart to be examples to follow. So by venerating them, we are honoring the image and likeness within them of God that they let shine forth. So this is all sort of what comes out of this council. It was considered rather triumphant at the time because they had been so visibly removed from so many churches. So I should say, despite being well loved by the people, there was a very top-down kind of push to get them removed. And so their return was a very joyful and triumphant one for the people who loved the saints and loved the icons of the saints and felt very strongly that this was an important part of the church life.
It's kind of like the Catholic Church now, like I was saying, like there's no more, even though there's no iconoclast in the West, but it's almost like there is no saints being venerated with all of them around the church, mosaics, and very well other like murals and stuff, but there's no more actual saints all around. They separate themselves and just Christ. That's really it.
I actually read, I had that same thought. A friend invited me to mass at a church, and yeah, it was pretty bare. There was like barely anything. It looked like the church, one of the churches that I grew up in, a Protestant church.
Yeah, I think that's more common in the U.S. I mean, certainly if you go to the cathedral in Venice, it looks like one of our
Probably,
churches.
yeah,
Or ceiling mosaics.
Yeah, St. Peter's, but like a lot of that when I was in Italy, it's mostly the actual, just like, I forgot, frescoes, they call it frescoes and mosaics, but no, there's no saints.
Stained glass too.
Yeah, stained glass.
Stained glass and stained glasses.
Yeah.
We don't tend to do stained glass as much, although you do see it in churches. I will also say, although I don't remember this is going to be talked about later, but whatever it is, we don't have anything wrong. We don't have anything against statues. Don't let anyone try and tell you otherwise. For exactly the thing I just said. Yes, if you are putting a golden calf in your home and worshiping it, yeah, we got a problem with that. If you have a statue of a saint and you are venerating it like an icon, fine. I've seen Orthodox churches with statues of Orthodox saints that get sensed like any of the other icons at the appropriate time and services for that. You can find in museums in both Russia and Greece whole collections of statues from different periods of time. It is very much a part of our tradition to have statues. It's just not as common as the icons, which are everywhere. You will go in every Orthodox church anywhere at any point in time and find icons, with maybe a few years around this council.
The monastery that's here, Losi Monastery, they have like a chestnut statue, like somebody that used to live at the monastery.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously we don't have a problem with like random statues of people, but I mean in terms of treating it like an icon, giving the veneration we would for an icon to a statue is not something that's outside of our tradition. Don't let anyone try and tell you otherwise.
Like there was like St. Herman, there was like instead of
Sure, yeah.
back there was like
There's
this
a
like
little
statue.
carved statue of St. Herman, yeah.
Actually, speaking of St. Herman, there's a studio called St. Herman Studios, which does like carved icons that are like, what's the word? Three-dimensional.
Oh, reliefs.
Reliefs, it's a relief, yeah, so, yeah, that's becoming a little more.
There's a
common.
big statue of St. Tikhon that was done at the monastery by the same name, Pennsylvania. Which had a lot of flack online, we know about it, but.
Wow. So I have a question about the second count, or the iconoclasm, is that, so this is post-Chalcedon, so you wouldn't have had iconoclasm in sort of the non-Chalcedonian churches, but they continue to do icons, so I think by that very like reality, you would see that icons were just like always there, always part of the church. That's really in the sort of.
I think maybe what you're hinting at is that there are those that try and say that this is where icons became a thing.
Right, yeah.
Yes, you are very much correct in pointing out that the non-Chalcedonian and the Nestorian church also use icons.
Right, and they never had their iconoclasm in the way that the Orthodox Church did.
Very much, like I said at the beginning,
Yeah.
refining the theology the church had always had, not coming up with new things. All right, I do want to call out that these ecumenical councils are basically larger forms of local councils, which by canon have to happen every year. So the Diocese of the West here, this diocese that you're currently in, as a council every year, where we meet and we discuss theological things going on within our diocese. Some of it is just sort of general, getting the pulse on how things are going here, but if there's problems, concerns, that's the time that we discuss them. And also every 3 years we do an All-American Council, which is all of the dioceses of the North American Church here come together, the OCA, and do a very similar thing, talk about, again, some of it is just general reports on how things are going and the health of the church here, but also discussion on theological issues and modern problems that the church is running into today. Of course, you'll see statements from the synod sometimes that are a little more decisive and quick about things. So sometimes you'll see statements put out immediately after a headline comes up or something like that from the synod. But this is where these councils that we do on a regular basis are the times when the church comes together, because the types of discussions that we talked about here, just we don't tend to raise them to ecumenical status. One, because this is just North America, we don't have representation from everywhere. And two, we're not really discussing issues of the entire church. Were there such issues to talk about, we would, but the reality is we kind of haven't had anything like that. Maybe the exception would be, so I do want to point out, you will sometimes see lists that list more than the 7 councils. There's at least one that is fairly common to see numbered. There's another one, even a little later, which is sometimes included in lists by people. And it's true. There is nothing that says that we can't have another ecumenical council. And by the way that some of these people defend, at least the one that they sometimes call the ecumenical council, from our side standpoint anyway, we treat, it was an issue that was surrounding the entire church, and a lot of the canons that were published by it are universal today. And all of the churches everywhere in the world follow it, which is basically the definition of an ecumenical council. We just don't call it that. So I don't want you to think that we had 7 and now that's all that's ever happened and all that ever will happen, right? In the Catholic world, obviously they have any number, Vatican I and II, which are often just referred to by that. They consider those to be some of many councils that they have continued to have for quite some time. Their list of ecumenical councils is much longer than ours. We've just not had those types of problems for quite some time. Not to say, again, that we haven't had problems, but it's mostly been able to be dealt with on the local level, or maybe on the one step up like the All-American Council, not really something that's bridging gaps and becoming a major problem in the church all over the world, like we were seeing with historianism or Arianism or something like that. Just taking the church by storm. So, all right. Like I said before, the other thing that we kind of make a distinction about with these councils is that, it's one thing to discuss what to do with a priest or bishop that's done bad or naughty things or whatever, but that doesn't really qualify for the ecumenical status, right? When we talk about these councils, the other part of it isn't just that everyone's there, not just that it's a problem with ecumenical church, but that specifically it's about some core tenet of our faith, something that is very important to who we are, not just how we discipline someone or how we bring someone back into the church or that kind of thing.
Like, for example, like if Mormonism originated in the Orthodox Church, and then all of a sudden, Orthodox,
Yes.
something like that.
Yes. If the Mormons were trying to be a branch of Orthodoxy, they had come from the Orthodox Church, or they're trying to say, no, we're Orthodox,
Yeah.
what do you mean?
Or like started from Orthodox
Yes.
bishop in North America.
Absolutely.
Like that one.
That would be something where there would almost certainly be a council, they're all over the world, they're doing their thing, if they were trying to say that they were Orthodox, then yeah, that would be a problem, and that would be of ecumenical nature. Weird example, but yep.
Like really clear though.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we already talked a good bit about some of this, the Christ's nature and will and the importance of that, so I'll speak to that. I do want to point out also, I think we talked a little bit about this in some of our previous sessions, but just again to highlight, iconography isn't a unique see, like I talked about before, in the Jewish understanding of the way that the temple was to be made, there's iconographic images all over. Also, this particular style of a person was a secular style of just painting portraits. You can find examples that predate Christianity that look remarkably like our icons, just without the halo and the churchy stuff. They're just kind of people.
Yeah, like that. So from I heard from the Lord Spirit podcast, they're actually talking about like that. The old, I think Second Temple Judaism icons back then actually were key to helping like biblical scholars try to figure out more what certain stories meant, because specifically icons that were preserved.
Yep. But again, I just want to be very clear, even outside of the religious world at all, this particular style, I believe, is like a Byzantine style of just painting people. So it would be sort of like if, just the way we take photographs today, down the line became like a style that is specifically sought after and thought of as a special thing. But I'll point out, in a very similar nature, the robes that I'm wearing were from before the church was like, this is not a Christian thing in its creation. This is something that the church adopted, and the rest of the world left behind, and we still do. So now we look at this and we go, that's an Orthodox thing. But that's not where it came from originally. We're just the only ones left still doing it. It's the same thing with the icons, right? This was very common in the ancient world. But, like I said, images in general, like you pointed out, were absolutely a part of Judaism before Christianity. To get back to the discussion of whether or not they were just created in the Seventh Council there. Yeah.
So this raises kind of more of a theological question, but so then in that case, for instance, like this retreat had the wonder word or the myrrh streaming icon of Saint Anna. So there's like clearly something very powerful going on with the icons.
Yeah, but I'll point out, this is very broad, so maybe it's bad, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Does anyone know what probably the most popular myrrh streaming icon in North America is?
Is it the Ibram?
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably, you know an icon. It's a print. It's a print. It's not painted on wood with paint, right? It's a print. It's not. There's a few instances of that I'm aware of where we're streaming it's just a print. That's another reason why and you'll see this in some Orthodox churches, they're trying to be a little more cognizant of things. Try not to print bulletins with big old icons on them, or put out various forms of publications with icons on them. Because yes, it's not printed on or painted or written or whatever you want to use for your verb there in the sort of traditional way. But it's not about that. That was the whole thing that council said was it's not the wood and the paint.
Yeah.
It's the image of the person that matters, and specifically the image of a person who allowed their image and likeness of God to shine by following His will very well. So that's the important part, not the physical material it's made out of.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. Yeah.
There's also, because I think you talked about it with you before, but it's because we never fully die in Christ, so that's a living portrait of that person.
Yeah,
basically,
very much
right?
so. I had someone ask me just the other day what we would think about icons done with acrylic paint. I was like, the icons, we just don't tend to do that because we kind of have an idea of the look of an icon and the way that it wears and fades with time, which is specific to the egg tempera style that we tend to use. But yeah, if you used acrylic paint, then we'd have an icon with acrylic paint. That's just what that would be.
But also the Byzantine style particularly, that's like I said, that's just more of a church tradition now, but even if there was a really realistic one.
I mean, look at the icon of St. Seraphim there versus the icon, some of them over here that are, a lot more flat. Or if you go at some point, look at any of the three we have up front with the metallic plates around them, right? They're much more realistic looking than which we don't have very many of the super iconic Byzantine style with the like really chunky shading. You do see that sometimes, so yeah, I mean, the style varies from one to another, the materials vary.
Yeah, I
The types of
know
wood, the types of paint, ink, whatever.
like the Russian style icons are like very more like realistic.
Yeah,
Kind of reminds you of like the Western, like, art.
and I'll be honest, we talk about the American church sometimes suffering from a crisis of identity, of not like being its own thing and being an amalgam of other things, but I will say actually in iconography, we kind of do have a unique style that's starting to appear, which is kind of a middle ground between the more historic Greek style that was very much not trying to be an accurate representation of the person, but not really being the older Russian style that's super much, just a very Middle Ages or whatever, Victorian type of painting that's very like realistic and 3D and nice shading and everything like that. It's kind of a middle ground that we start to see in a lot of our icons, which is actually most of what we have here is kind of a middle ground. Anyway, all right. Now we talked about worship and veneration. I do want to just call out really quick. I said this before, but not quite so clearly. So saints and icons don't replace God, right? When I've heard people ask this question, it's a pretty common question. Well, why would I pray to a saint when I could just pray to God? You can just pray to God. We don't have a problem with that. It is absolutely acceptable to just replace to God. Praying to saints is an additional thing we do. Unless you were spending 24/7 praying to God, you probably have some spare time somewhere. You could also pray to a saint, right? It's not replacing praying to God. We worship God, and if you follow any of our services, you'll know that is the bulk of what we do in our services, is worship God. So that is very central to what we do. We make a distinction that we can also offer prayers to saints as well, as an additional thing. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, fine. It is very much okay to just pray directly to God for things, right? That is not outside of our tradition. There are plenty of prayers written to God in our tradition.
Yeah, like I hear like the most common one is the verse saying like that Christ is the mediator. So everybody's like, well, why would I pray to a saint? To Christ one is like exactly.
Then in that case, don't ask your friends to pray for you.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the very common response is twofold. One, well, if you're, flailing around in the water because you fell out of a boat, are you going to pray to God, or are you going to ask the person standing right there to throw you a life jacket, right? I mean, but also, it says the prayers of a mother avail much, and also the prayers of a righteous man, right? All these things are called out in Scripture. So, yeah, pray to them. Not with worship that's due to God alone, but asking for help finding your keys, or because you're worried about an upcoming test, or because they lived a life of struggles that are very similar to your own, and you want help with that. Fine, yeah, wonderful. Pray to saint, ask for their help. They stand at the throne of God, right? So they will pray for you on behalf of you. That is okay. But again, wildly different thing. I think really a lot of that discussion comes from not fully understanding what our worship looks like compared to veneration. I had it called out. We just did a funeral this morning, the Monarchy the night before, and the vigil of the night, and someone commented to me on how it was wonderful to simultaneously have the service be focused on the person who just died, but also still be worshiping God through it. That even though this is a funeral service for someone who's died, we don't neglect to worship God in that service. It's still very central to that service. But again, I think if you're coming from a world where there's not a lot of distinction between that, then it's very easy to kind of collapse those down into one thing and say, well, if I'm going to spend my time praying, why don't I pray to God? Fine, pray to God, worship God. I mean, it's appropriate to worship God, but it's also okay to ask intercessions from the saints.
I remember, was it last week with St. John of San Francisco, Shanghai? Like, if you listen to it, you're very clear. If you're not praying to St. John, it's say, Holy Higher St. John, pray for us.
Yeah.
So
and even in the times where we use language like most holy Theotokos save us, we don't believe, we're not saying that because she is by her own power saving us. Just like when you fall into the water and you ask to be saved, You're not expecting them to be the ones actually saving your soul. You're expecting them to take an action to help you. That's what we expect when we say Most Holy Theotokos Saviours, is that she be the intercessor for us to ask God to pray for us, in addition to the ways that we also ask God directly all the time, right? But we know the prayers of the Mother. Ask for her intercessions. All right. I also want to point out that we put icons everywhere. You will often, if you eventually become Orthodox, you will probably at some point ask me, how do I deal with this thing? And I will tell you, put an icon there. If you're the type of person that struggles with internet use or management of time on computers in general, put an icon next to your computer. I've told many people to do that. Or set your background to be an icon, or just do something so that you're interacting with an icon during some part of that time. You'll see plenty of our parishioners that drive up and have an icon somewhere on their dashboard or something like that. It's pretty common to just put icons everywhere. They help us to focus on God. We're reminded of their lives, on the ways that they served God in their life, and we try to emulate that. That means we use them as reminders sometimes. I think, again, even more so because we just had a funeral, but we gravitate towards these people because they're people like us, right? They know our struggles. Of course God knows, right? Of course Jesus knows, because he was man and he walked among us and he went through all the struggles he did, but it hits a little differently, like I've mentioned a number of times. One of the icons, I think it's St. Herman, but I never remember for sure, one of the Alaskan saints, has an icon that has around the border a bunch of different scenes from his life, and one of them shows him riding a helicopter. And it just hits a little different to see an icon of a saint sitting in modern machinery like that. You're like, yeah, you were in my time, sort of, right? I mean, you're familiar with the struggles of here, in North America, at this time. You know the struggles of traffic.
Or
right?
like St. Olga over there, she very recent.
Exactly, right?
Yes.
And we just have a connection with people that struggled and did bad things, but eventually did the right thing, right? So that's a normal part of our human existence, to gravitate towards people that do good things and want to emulate them, right? So that's what saints are. Yes.
2 questions
Yeah.
on this subject. The first being, so in practice, as I understand it, being glorified or canonized comes about through, it sounds like, a variety of things happening at once, right? That it's, so, speaking of, someone having just proposed, in the Orthodox Church, is it common to then ask that person or family member who's proposed for their prayers?
Of course.
Yeah. Because there's a belief that this person is in the presence of God.
Yeah, so maybe it's a good thing to just discuss that on. So I think there's kind of some question about how one becomes a saint. And I think sometimes there's a feeling of like, well, you can force it, and so what happens if you canonize the wrong person because you just didn't know that they did a bunch of bad stuff? Well, that's not how we canonize people.
Right.
Look at St. Olga and how she was canonized. It happened because she lived a holy life, yes. But more so, it happened because she died and people recognized that she was a saint. And not just a few people, but a lot of people. And not just for a little bit of time, but continuing. Many years, continuing until present times. And so, really, what the church is doing isn't so much making a new proclamation. No one is like, oh, really? Saying, oh, really? Olga? that lady? Right? This is someone the church is already effectively treating like a saint. And the church basically just gives the stamp of approval to say, yes, this person that you all pretty much already know is a saint is a saint. And we do have some minor technical differences at the glorification of a saint. We do the final panachia, which is praying for the repose of their soul, for God to be merciful to them. And then we sing the first service to them, where we ask for their prayers and intercessions as a saint. But again, that's as a liturgical body of the church, not as an individual. So absolutely on your own, Yeah, very much so. I would expect that the family of the Repositors
Yeah,
would, just as much as they would have when he was alive, ask for help with things, right?
Right, and so I guess the kind of what I alluded to is this idea that like, it wasn't that people were just praying to Saint Olga, it's that Saint Olga was like appearing in dreams to
Sure.
people like,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
in other states, and
Mhm.
there was like miraculous circumstances
Yeah.
around the saint.
Yep. Although that's really not, strictly speaking, a requirement.
Right,
of this
okay.
process, but it is common.
Right, yeah,
You read the lives of many saints, and you see that.
yeah.
Either during their life or after.
So then in that state, so kind of spinning off of that, so I come from a tradition where
Just real quick, in case anyone cares, it's 7:30. But, please continue.
I come from a tradition where, and I think this is a kind of a reflex or reaction, a very Protestant reflex or reaction to sort of saints, is like, well, we're all saints. And so I don't believe that anymore, per se, but in the way that they're espousing it. But I'm curious to know sort of how the Orthodox Church would look at this idea that there are people who really are holier than other people, right? And that that doesn't necessarily invalidate
So
the faith of another, right? There is a hierarchy, but it's not kind of like a sainthood communism where everyone's like the same level, right? Yeah.
I'll make two notes here. The first is to remind you something I think I said before, which is that, well, what does saint mean?
It's like holy and
Holy
righteous,
one.
right?
Holy, yeah. So that's why it is acceptable to say that we are all trying, at least,
Yeah.
to be saints. Absolutely. That's why Paul talks about the holy ones, saints and wherever, because they were doing a good job, whereas sometimes he writes letters about churches that were doing a real bad job, right? But it's absolutely acceptable to talk about people being holy in life. It's very common to read the lives of saints and to see the miracles they're performing. And yeah, you better believe people talk about them at the time as being a living saint, which is, in English, maybe a kind of reasonable thing to say, but again, when you're kind of understanding what that means, like, yeah, of course you can be alive and be holy, right? That's not really a weird thing for us.
Like St. John the Baptist, everybody thought that he was the actual Messiah because how holy of a person he was in his lifetime.
Yeah, right, great example. But there are so many others as well, right? I mean, so many. I mean, we just sang a service for St. Constantine and talked about all the miraculous healings that they were able to do, right? This is not a unique thing to just a few people. Many miracles are worked by all sorts of saints in their lifetimes, that are recognized by people in their lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's often part of why they end up getting somewhat of a following when they die and end up becoming saints, because all of these people were touched by them. Sometimes close by, like you point out, sometimes very far away. And you can tell, right, that this was a holy person. This was someone that lived a holy life, that was obedient to God and His will, and needs to be remembered for that.
Out of curiosity, talking about like canonizations, why wasn't Seraphim Rose like canonized? If like the whole Orthodox world acknowledges his holiness.
Well, I'll say I don't think the whole Orthodox world recognizes His holiness, and that's part of why he hasn't been. He does have some controversial parts of his life. He is certainly widely considered to be saintly, but certainly not.
Because like his views, I guess, of certain things is like, I guess.
I think part of it is that he wrote about a lot of things, and some of it's just not stuff we write about, and so it's just sort of weird. And like, it's not strictly outside of our tradition, but it's not really in it either. He writes a lot about aliens and stuff. Like, we just don't- I mean, like, is it wrong? I mean, no, I guess, but it's hard to say that it's necessarily inside our tradition, because that's not something that we see other saints writing about. So are his opinions on this wrong? Maybe not, but it's certainly not as easy to clearly point and say, well, look, right, he's saying things in the way that we recognize as the church. So, yeah, but another good example of something that's a lot less controversial, but also not a saint, is the Archbishop Dimitri of the South. Why he considered to be a saint, and yet sometimes these things just take time. I think, especially with Mother Olga, or Saint Olga, there was a big push for her, specifically because a lot of the saints in North America are clergy. And so it was refreshing for a lot of people to have someone who was not, although I guess she was married to the priest, but still. And a lot of the saintly things that she did, the holy things that she did, were not related to sacraments or the way of leading the church as much as it was just being a good person in her community. And that resonated with a lot of people. So, is that to say that Seraphim Rose or Archbishop Dimitri won't be canonized? Absolutely not. They very much could be at some point in time. And there are certainly those calling for them to be, but they just haven't yet.
And do you think maybe, sorry if this is off topic, but do you think one of the reasons why Seraphim Rose hasn't been like canonized is it because he maybe had some like true Orthodox or like genuine Orthodox views? Because like in his book Orthodoxy, the Origin of the Future, he kind of like promoted some of like the genuine Orthodox churches.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm not a hierarch, so I can't talk about any like actual specific reasons for those discussions, which I'm sure have come up and happened. But yeah, I mean, like I said, usually when we declare someone a saint, it's because there is no dissent. The church is unanimous in proclaiming this person to be a saint. And with him, it's not really as clear cut. So there's certainly many people that do, but there are others that are a little more skeptic. So I think that's part of it.
I have a question regarding Seraphim Rose as well, just because I find his writings really interesting, actually.
Sure.
I think they've been very helpful for me.
I've never met anyone to say that his writings are bad.
Right,
You
yeah.
should read them.
Yeah.
Again, it's more of a question of some of those things just fall very much outside the realm of what the rest of the
Sure.
scholars have written about.
So in that same way, I'm very, and I'm not like, I don't have a dog in this particular fight, but I'm now very curious about the toll houses and how that fits in. I know that's also a controversial subject.
About his views on that and how that could relate to his canonization, or just about the toll houses in general?
Just toll houses in general, because I understand kind of different sides of that discussion, and I'm kind of curious to know sort of your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, I'm afraid I might disappoint you, but I'm going to stand firm and say it does not matter.
Yeah.
Don't teach to the test.
Mm.
If they're there and you have lived a life in Christ and you have done what Jesus has told you to do, they'll be fine if they're there. And if they're not, and you've lived a good life in Christ and you've done what Jesus told you to do, you'll also be fine. So maybe focus a little more on getting your own life in order, and then once you've solved that, then we can talk about
It almost, yeah, because it almost feels like a secondary issue in a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah. I think we want certainty, and now there's a question mark because someone has proposed something that fits somewhat within the framework of the church, and we see other things from other fathers that kind of hint at the same thing, or even sometimes they're a little more explicit. And so now there's this big question about, well, is this part of the church or is this not? But again, and I think this is part of why we really don't have a formal statement, and I kind of feel like we're not going to get one.
Yeah.
Because it's just not core to who Christ is and our relationship to him, which is the important thing. That's what matters.
Right.
If we follow him, if we, feed the hungry and clothe the naked and heal the sick and do all the things he told us to do, then maybe we can have some extra room to think about toll houses. But until then, do those things. And if they're there, you'll be fine, and if not, you'll still be fine.
Yeah, I find it a fascinating idea, but one
Sure.
that I think, like, I just, for whatever reason, don't have much, like, concern about.
Yeah, and I would never tell someone that was interested not to pay attention to it or read more about it. If you want to do that, fine. But don't get caught up in thinking that this has to be either a absolutely true thing or an absolutely untrue thing. It just isn't really that important. It's sort of like if you got really caught up in St. Dionysius' writings on the angelic orders, and then you got really sure about something. It's like, okay, well maybe, but like,
might become a distraction, yeah.
Yeah, it's not what we're here for.
Right.
We're not doing our services so we can check a box for a toll house, right? Like, so,
Yeah, that's
How would I explain, because I know, because I have a sticker of St. Eustace, it's not an icon of it, but it's a sticker of my water bottle, and like my friends at work, they look them up, and they see his whole profile, like all the wonder work that he does, and it's really hard to explain, rather than just like, yeah, you become like such full of grace, he's a vessel of Christ, that you always see, and where you're like my dad, like, he asked me, like, why don't we have any more prophets besides Christ? Besides, like, well, the fulfillment, so there's no more, but I was like, well, there's saints that do, like, very wonder work and stuff, so it's like, what's the actual, like, church standard, how to explain how
So-
certain saints are able to do these certain things?
I will make a distinction here. The prophets, as we talk about, appointed Christ.
Yeah.
We can't have more prophets because Christ has already come. That doesn't mean that we can't have prophetic speech, right? You can certainly see in the future and make prophecies. People have done that in the Orthodox Church and continue to do so. It is not uncommon to hear of some saintly person having some vision of or whatever. But my response to all of that would be exactly the same as to the toll houses, right? If it comes true, wonderful. It's a good sign that they're probably saint. If not, okay, follow Christ. Do those things. And if these things come true, great. But our salvation is found now. Not in the future, not in the past, now. So do what you need to do to follow Christ right now. The rest of that will come. As to your actual question about how to talk about that, I mean, yeah, our church is very much alive.
Yeah.
Our saints are very much still doing miracles to this day. Saint Olga is a wonderful example. Look at all of the miracles she's performed both in life and after. It is very much a part of our church to have miraculous things continuing. Anyone who tries to claim that that is not happening isn't in the Orthodox Church. It just isn't aware. But, I mean, everything from, you hear stories of spiritual monks that will meet someone and have a whole conversation with them, and someone later will go up and ask, and they'll say, God, I want a conversation with so-and-so. They'll be like, you speak different languages. How did you have a conversation? Well, I did. I don't know. It was a wonderful conversation, and I was very edified by it.
Yeah.
And, well, okay, glory to God. You'll hear, saints that know that someone is struggling with something and will call them as they're about to do whatever. Don't bring your life to do that thing. Because they knew that they were about to do something bad. Tell the stories of that kind of thing happening after someone is dead, and receiving a call and having a conversation and finding out later that actually that person had already died. And we just didn't know that yet. There's stories, again, I can't remember seeing this in St. Herman, who traveled around to a lot of different islands, and so people didn't necessarily see him all the time, but they very much knew him and very much loved him. And it was a surprise when certain Russians, or I think it was Russians, started coming around and trying to collect stories of the life of the saint, to try and publish information as they're trying to canonize this person. And the response from some of the inhabitants is, he's dead. But he was just here last week. So, again, the saints are very much alive in our church. We very much continue to have many miracles all the time. I think it's very easy to look back on the stories of the New Testament and of the early church and to try and think that we've somehow lost something. But remember, we're basically reading the highlights, right? If you lived one city over, you might not know that that thing happened, right? We only hear about it today because that group of people recorded it and it got translated and passed around, and now in our modern time, everyone knows about that thing. But at the time, unless you were there, you probably didn't know about it.
Yeah,
It's the
like,
same thing we see now, is unless you know that saint
Yeah.
and the thing that person did because he did it to you or someone you know, you probably don't know about it. But in 50 years, it's going to be like St. Olga, right?
Yeah.
Where we're passing around all the stories, it becomes very common knowledge, all of the things that this person did.
I was saying, or even like St. John, that one day, you were almost not like for 30 minutes, you were naming all these things, like he went to hospitals, he was healing people, and then exactly, it's like, why would, like, did that guy, like, end up in the news? It's just, like, that one always, like, I see from a lot of the Saints. There's another one, St. Louis, I think, from a couple weeks back on OCA, I think it's St. Louis of Laguna, somewhere over at the east. But, like, you see all of them, too, like, they're never boastful about it, too, so chances are, like, they'll probably even tell anybody, because I think he had the gift of clairvoyance, and then every time they asked him, like, oh, they got it. Oh, I know what you're talking about. And they said, like, you really do. Like, you know, like, he was always like, I don't know. And then, like, it was like he would just know things that it just, there's no possible way, just always deny it, too. And, like, St. Paisios, like, you know, like, one of very modern, like, from what I can see, like, a very beloved one, all those type of things that he did, and nobody in Greece heard him until probably he died. And like exactly said, then these stories that got published by this Howard monk, and then you're the same thing, like, this person actually existed,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, there's a humility that comes with holiness that sort of precludes you from being super loud and yelling from mountaintops that
Yeah, they do this.
everyone would know about it, yeah.
Yeah.
So, it reminds me of Magus, the magician that we see in the Acts, who's
Oh, we tried.
loud and prideful about all the things he could do, right? And-
Yeah.
And it was not a good thing.
He was also trying to, like, how much is it to buy this Holy Spirit that you guys talk about? Like, it's not for sale. What are you talking about?
It also reminds you of like the errors of like the charismatic movement, how like a lot of these preachers, you know, tend to boast that, you know, they're prophets and that they do these healing services, like the Benny Hinn, for example. They're very boastful. It seems to be like a prosperity gospel. If, you know, pretty much saying, oh, if you give me money, you'll be cured or something like that, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Or the people that predict the end of the world,
Oh.
and it never comes true. You know, like never, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like if you're gonna go into predicting things, maybe don't do that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, every time I see those, I always think like this is obviously just a grifter. Like the one that the one fake priest always comes up when we're talking about like he's very big. Always, whenever I see him, like I don't want to hear it. Big,
Yeah.
So those people that like do those like math calculations like predict the rapture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lots of things wrong with that one.
Did you meet anybody like that, Father, when you went to Mount Athos, or like at least not even just like a wonder worker, but like somebody in a sense like where you talking about like you just feel
Oh.
a sense of holiness?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've run into that in almost all the monasteries I've gone to, in at least one person, but yeah, there was at least one, monk who spent some time going with us, that was, yeah.
Amazing. I actually think that's a really beautiful thing, that there are these holy people that don't get like a bunch of headlines about them, because it shows that the church is alive and that God's grace is being poured out on people, like just us, right? Like as we come across people. You
I
know?
would make the same argument that we make for a lot of things, which would also be that, this is maybe a slightly deeper theological topic, but again, love requires free will, right? We can't love God if we are constantly being smacked upside the face with all of the wonderful, powerful acts that are going on in the world around us, right? We have to be able to reject that if it is free, and it has to be free if it's going to be loved. So to love Him, we have to be able to look at some of that stuff and go, yeah, I don't think so. It doesn't do it for me. Or look at that and go, wow, that's incredible, and have that be the thing that moves you and brings you to church. But you need to be able to do both things, and
Yeah.
that's, I think, where that humility comes from. Where if it was a big, loud, public thing every time it happened, then yeah, it would kind of make it seem like, well, why aren't you here? Look at all of the amazing things. I mean, how could you possibly be anywhere else?
Right. I mean, people would still reject it even if it was a huge miracle on TV.
A song, but
Yeah.
Or obviously that'd be Christ. I mean, you did all those
Oh,
things.
yeah. Well, a good example of that is the, so you know what happens at the resurrection of the Holy Sepulchre and
Oh, the Holy Fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you can find videos of it. I mean, they do literal news reports
Yeah.
on this, and yet how many people actually know about it?
Yeah.
Despite
Right.
the fact that it is so easy to come by,
Yeah.
so easy to
Yeah,
read
and I
about.
saw too, there's so much like security to it, because like besides people think like, oh, it's a hoax, and I guess since it's Israel and it's very heavily guarded because it's in the West Bank, that the priest or the bishop that goes in there is heavily like patted down. So there's no way he's gonna bring anything in there. And then, but here's just
You
weird
can also
also
have like fake fire, right? Like that's really hard.
Yeah. Or like how like, you know, like this grand conspiracy, like you're gonna bring stuff in there when nobody's looking, and so it's like,
Well, and there's a lot of focus on the lighting of it, but the biggest thing to me is seeing people taking wads of candle, like 9 candles that are giant flames and just bathing their face in it. I'm like, okay, maybe they use white phosphor to light the thing in the Holy Sepulchre, but that's certainly not explaining the fact that this person is dousing their face in it and utterly
yes,
injured.
the one I saw was a video actually like yesterday, was a man had a beard like yours and put it right here. And we all know what happens with hair and fire, it's gonna burn and nothing happened to it. Which explains it a lot, because when we said like, now it's, like, because I thought he was just doing it like, oh, feel the heat, like, no, I think he was showing like, nothing's happening to me.
Yeah. No, again, that is a publicized thing.
That's true, that's true, that is a TV thing, yeah.
Speaking of miracles,
Sure.
what is like the Orthodox Church's stances on like, for example, like Our Lady of Zixun? I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Not at all.
It's when it happened in the, I think the 60s in Egypt. Mary appeared on top of a Coptic church for like days on end, and even like Muslims like sighed, and like a lot of people sighed because it happened for like days. And same thing with like, for example, like Our Lady of Guadalupe. You know, that's like
I don't know that either.
one of the most important events in, you know, for Latin America. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't try and say that the activity of the Holy Spirit or God or the saints is limited to these 4 walls. So, sure, yeah, I mean, Virgin Mary appears to the cops, fine. I guess my response would just sort of be, okay, that happens. It doesn't necessarily confirm or deny anything. God loves all of his creation. Some of us are a little more in our rejection of him than others, but that's not going to stop him from doing what he can to try and bring people in a way that still allows them to have some agency. So, sure, great.
Yeah, because one thing that reminds you, like a lot of Orthodox people kind of teach something about like spiritual delusion.
Yeah, that's absolutely possible. I mean, demons and devils and whatnot don't want us to find God, so sure. It is a pretty common thing you find in saints that have apparitions, for them to just ignore them. Saint or Virgin Mary appears or whatever, they just keep going with their prayers and ignore them until they absolutely cannot and have done everything they possibly can to make them go away and they don't. And they're like, okay, fine, I guess you must be real. But, so that is kind of, yeah, sometimes the response to that kind of thing, if it's just immediately, taken to be true, is like, well, maybe. I mean, could it be? Sure, absolutely. Could it be delusion? Yeah. Hard to say. Yeah, I guess my first response was just to be very clear that we don't say that that kind of thing can't happen. It absolutely can. But yes, you're absolutely right. Probably at least a good percentage of the time that people think about this kind of thing, it's probably some form of delusion or whatever. But without us being there and taking the normal steps we would to try and make them go away, hard to say. So, again, it would kind of fall under the whole houses thing of like, well, if they said something that was spiritually helpful for you, then fine, I guess do that. If not, then don't. And if you don't want to, regardless, fine. Jesus is the one we're supposed to be following. So, if one of those apparitions is like, well, actually, I'm Jesus, and do what I say. No, well, that would be a problem. But most of the time it's not, and it's some ancillary thing, and fine.
Are there like Orthodox equivalents like Marian apparitions? Has that like happened in the Orthodox Church?
Yeah, I mean, the example I just gave was a Marian apparition.
Wait, what was it?
A monastic in his cell doing a prayer rule, and the Virgin Mary knocks on the door and he ignores it. And
that's
finally
right.
he opens the door and sees the Virgin Mary and maybe 1 or 2 other saints, and just ignores it and goes back to doing his prayers and making his own cross.
When did this happen?
I don't remember. Yeah, finally, after appearing like 3 days in a row and not going away when he makes the sign of the cross and calls on the name of God, he's finally like, okay, fine, you must be real. And finally listens to what they have to say. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely not uncommon to have stories of saints that have apparitions from saints, Virgin Mary. Sure.
My sister actually is not Orthodox. I've been sharing Orthodoxy with her, and she had a dream about the Theotokos. Like she was saved from, essentially she was saved from a demonic dream by the Theotokos. Like she called on the Theotokos, and that's what freed her from the dream. So like, it happens, like, it absolutely happens.
Very much so. All right, that's 8 o'clock, which is my hard cutoff. 7:30 is the song. 8 o'clock is the hard cutoff, so.
It's your bedtime.
Eat it. Thank you all for coming. Next week is normal. Remember, the week after is the All-American Council I was talking about. So I will be out of town at that time. So you can come here, but I won't be here.
I think